It was a crisp evening in March of 1972, when the quiet suburban neighborhood of Laguna Niguel, California, would become the setting for one of the boldest bank heists in American history. An unlikely location, perhaps, for a high-stakes robbery that would go down in criminal lore. The United California Bank Heist would see millions vanish without a trace, leaving behind a city in shock, investigators bewildered, and a trail of questions that still linger today. But to truly understand how it all went down, you need to know the man behind it all, Amil Dinsio. Amil Dinsio wasn't your typical criminal. He didn't come from a desperate background or lack opportunity. No, Amil was from a regular Ohio neighborhood, the kind where people knew your name and families ate dinner together at 6 o'clock sharp. But from a young age, Amil had a fascination with breaking boundaries, testing limits, and outsmarting those around him. He wasn't like other kids. He saw puzzles where others saw problems, and he solved them with an ease that both impressed and worried his teachers. The world of rules was merely a game, and Amil loved winning. By the time he was in his late teens, Amil had already started flirting with petty crime. It was never about the money, not at first. It was the thrill, the adrenaline of getting away with something others would never dare. His knack for meticulously planning every detail made him stand out. He wasn't reckless. In fact, his level-headed approach, his precision, and his careful consideration of every variable meant he almost never got caught. To Amil, the thrill of outsmarting people, the authorities, the banks, the system itself, was an addiction he couldn't quit. For Amil, the path from petty crimes to sophisticated heists was a natural evolution. With every successful burglary, he grew bolder. He started surrounding himself with individuals who matched his ambition, his brother James, his nephews Harry and Ronald Barber, and other associates who each brought their own skills to the table. Together, they formed a tight-knit crew of professional burglars, men who trusted each other implicitly and who shared Amil's hunger for something bigger. And bigger it got. The United California Bank in Laguna Niguel was unlike anything Amil had targeted before. But with great risks came great rewards. Rumors had started to circulate. Rumors that a significant slush fund belonging to President Richard Nixon was being stored at the bank. Millions of dollars, untraceable, hidden from prying eyes. It was a story too tantalizing to ignore. Whether or not it was true didn't matter much to Amil. The possibility was enough to set his sights on that target. The heist was coming. The crew had rented a modest townhouse in Laguna Niguel, posing as a family to avoid suspicion. To the neighbors, they were just another group of out-of-towners enjoying the California sun. But inside, the men were preparing, drawing up blueprints, going over details, checking and rechecking equipment. They were preparing for something monumental, a heist that would go down in history, whether they succeeded or failed. Amil knew the risks. He knew that if they were caught, it wouldn't just mean a few years behind bars. This was federal-level crime. This was the kind of heist that would have the FBI breathing down their necks. But Amil had confidence. Confidence in his plan, in his crew, and in himself. Every detail had been considered. Every possible scenario had been played out in his mind. For Amil, it was as if the heist had already happened, and he was merely watching it play out. As the crew moved closer to executing their plan, the tension in the air was palpable. The stakes were higher than anything they had faced before, but so was the potential payoff. What would happen if they succeeded? What if they found Nixon's slush fund? What if they got away with it all? The questions hung in the air like a storm cloud, a mix of anticipation, excitement, and dread. Little did Amil know the heist would not just test his skills as a burglar. It would test his resilience, his loyalty, and his ability to adapt when things went awry. But before we get into the heist itself, before the dynamite, the vault, the millions in cash and valuables, let's take a moment to think about the man behind it all. Amil Dinsio wasn't just any thief. He was a mastermind, a man driven not by greed alone but by the challenge, the thrill, the desire to be untouchable. Stay with us as we take you through March 24th, 1972, the day that would change everything for Amil and his crew. What really happened inside the United California Bank that night? How did they pull off one of the most daring heists in history? And what were the consequences of taking on a job that big? We'll get into the heart of the heist, the plan, the action, and the aftermath that would make headlines across the country. Are you ready to step inside the mind of a mastermind? It was March 24th, 1972, a cool, starry evening in Laguna Niguel, California. The neighborhood was as tranquil as ever, with the kind of quiet that makes it hard to believe anything extraordinary could be happening. Behind manicured lawns and the silence of suburban life, something was stirring. On that night, a small group of men gathered in a rented townhouse, a place that seemed to blend in with all the other cookie-cutter homes in the area. They weren't there for a late-night poker game or a gathering of old friends. They were there to change the course of criminal history. For the last several weeks, this townhouse had served as their headquarters, a covert hub of activity that hid the grand plan, one that seemed so audacious it almost felt like fiction. This was not just any heist. It was the United California Bank, a target chosen not only for its wealth but for a perceived slush fund belonging to President Richard Nixon. And that's how it all started. A whisper, a rumor that had found its way to Amil Dinsio, the mastermind behind it all. And now, under the cover of darkness, it was time for action. Amil Dinsio was not your average criminal. To call him a simple burglar would be an understatement. He was a tactician, a planner who thrived on structure. For weeks, the plan had unfolded in his head like a well-rehearsed script. He had envisioned every possible scenario, every move, every second. It was almost like a chess game, except the stakes were millions of dollars, not just plastic pieces on a board. The townhouse had been their safe haven, a quiet, out-of-the-way base that would allow them to monitor their target, practice their entry, and keep a low profile. To the neighbors, they were just ordinary tenants. The crew even made sure that nothing looked suspicious. Their vehicles were parked neatly, curtains drawn, lights occasionally turned on or off to make it seem as if it was just another family staying there. They were careful, meticulous, and, above all, invisible. Inside that unassuming house, the crew's preparations were rigorous. They had amassed tools and equipment that looked innocuous, but in the hands of the right people would become weapons capable of bypassing some of the most advanced security systems of the time. Amil gathered drills, dynamite, and blueprints of the bank. He spent countless sleepless nights poring over those blueprints. Every inch of the building was studied. He knew the thickness of the concrete, the type of locks they would face, and even the rotation schedules of the security guards. He didn't leave anything to chance. March 24th, 1972, wasn't just any night. It was the culmination of weeks of planning, strategizing, and dreaming of the impossible. For Amil and his crew, this was the moment that would either make or break them. As nightfall enveloped the streets of Laguna Niguel, Amil, James, Harry, Ronald, Charles, and Phil moved out. They wore black clothing, their faces set in expressions of focus and determination. This was it, what they had prepared for so meticulously. The bank loomed ahead, a massive structure that promised so much. But first, they had to get inside, and that meant scaling the building to gain access to the roof. In the darkness, they moved with an almost supernatural stealth, careful not to make any noise. The air was tense, each member knowing that one mistake could jeopardize everything. The dynamite was set up on the rooftop, positioned precisely according to Amil's instructions. They couldn't afford any miscalculations. A mistake here could bring the entire police force down on them. After setting the charges, there was a pause, a moment that seemed to stretch on forever as they all held their breath. Amil took one last look at the setup, and with a small nod he signaled for the fuse to be lit. They braced themselves. The explosion, though controlled, was deafening in the stillness of the night. Dust and debris flew, and for a split second there was a tense silence as they waited to see if alarms would go off, if lights would flash, if they would hear sirens. Nothing happened. They were in. The men descended into the vault, eyes wide, adrenaline rushing. This was the sight they had been waiting for. The vault, cracked open, its treasures waiting. The cash, the bonds, the jewelry. It was all there, piled up in a way that almost seemed to mock the complexity of their heist. They moved quickly, emptying out what they could. And yet something was missing, the supposed slush fund they had heard about. The rumored millions belonging to President Nixon were nowhere to be found. It was a ghost, a myth that had lured them here. But no one spoke of it. There was no time for disappointment. They had to work fast. To understand why Amil Dinsio was so successful, one had to understand the man himself. Amil wasn't motivated by simple greed. For him, the heist was a work of art, a chance to prove that no lock, no vault, no building was beyond his reach. He was a perfectionist, the kind of man who wouldn't rest until every detail was planned out, every obstacle accounted for. In interviews conducted years later, Amil spoke about the heist not with remorse, but with a sense of accomplishment. He took pride in the challenge it had presented, the fortified vault, the security systems, the need for complete precision. He admired the craft of it all. It wasn't just about getting the money. It was about outsmarting those who thought they were invincible. He had an almost philosophical approach to crime, believing that if he could exploit the flaws in a system, then those flaws deserved to be exposed. And he wasn't alone. His crew followed him not just out of loyalty, but out of respect. They believed in Amil, trusted his instincts. He was more than a leader. He was the architect of their shared ambition. The way he spoke, the way he conducted himself, it was as though he knew something others didn't, and that sense of certainty inspired confidence in everyone around him. By morning, news of the heist had spread like wildfire. The residents of Laguna Niguel were stunned, struggling to comprehend how something so audacious could have happened in their backyard. The United California Bank, an institution considered impenetrable, had been breached, its vault emptied, its security measures rendered useless by a group of men who had managed to vanish without a trace. Television crews swarmed the area, reporters standing outside the bank's entrance, their microphones held tightly as they described the scene to viewers across the nation. An incredible breach, a daring heist, millions stolen in one night. These were the phrases that were repeated over and over. The vault, once thought to be uncrackable, now stood as a symbol of vulnerability. The people of Laguna Niguel were torn, some terrified that criminals could operate so close to their homes, others secretly admiring the audacity of it all. It was a story of legend, a story that seemed larger than life, and the men who pulled it off were invisible ghosts in the night. The United California Bank itself was in complete shock. Officials scrambled to assess the damage, the losses. Their reputation was tarnished. How could a group of criminals bypass everything they had in place? The vault had been their pride, their promise to customers that their valuables were safe. And now that promise lay shattered, the millions stolen not just in currency but in trust. The bank's officials were left to answer questions they didn't have answers to, left to face a public that demanded accountability. As we end this part of the story, we leave you with a question that has haunted this heist for decades. Was it all worth it? The millions stolen, the risks taken, the chaos that followed. Amil and his crew had accomplished what many believed was impossible. But at what cost? Was the thrill of defying the system enough to justify the consequences that awaited them? The story was far from over. The heist was just the beginning. The aftermath, the investigation, the pursuit, the inevitable capture was yet to come. But for that one night, they had tasted success. They had challenged the boundaries of what was possible, and they had won. Or had they? Were you aware of this heist? Did you know that a group of men from Ohio could bring an entire banking institution to its knees in a single night? Stay with us as we uncover what happened after the dust settled, how the hunt began, the mistakes that would lead to their downfall, and how the United California Bank Heist would forever be etched into the annals of criminal history. Before the night of the heist that shook the United California Bank, there was a plan, a brotherhood, and a promise. The heist was not the work of a single genius. It was the effort of a team, a group of men who knew each other, trusted each other, and shared a common goal. Amil Dinsio may have been the mastermind, but without his crew, the dream would never have turned into reality. The story of this heist was, at its heart, a story of trust, loyalty, and ambition, a brotherhood that dared to defy the impossible. But who were these men that Amil trusted with his life, with his plan, and with millions of dollars hanging in the balance? How did they come together, and what drove them to cross the line from ambition to crime? This is the story of how the conspiracy began, a story that started not with explosives and vaults, but with whispered conversations, carefully planned meetings, and a promise of wealth beyond imagination. The team was a motley crew. Each member had a unique role, and without any one of them, the heist would have fallen apart. Amil Dinsio knew that he needed not just loyal men, but men with skills that complemented each other. And so, the crew came together, each man bringing with him a different piece of the puzzle. Amil's brother, James Dinsio, was more than just family. He was Amil's right-hand man, his enforcer. James was a man of action, someone who didn't flinch in the face of risk. He was the muscle, the one who would make sure that if anything went wrong, he could handle it. Where Amil was the meticulous planner, James was the enforcer, the man who ensured that no one would stand in their way. James had always looked up to Amil, admiring his brother's intelligence, his ability to see a plan where others only saw chaos. He had been with Amil on previous jobs and he knew the stakes. For James, the heist wasn't just about money, it was about proving himself, about showing that he was every bit as capable as his older brother. It was about loyalty, family, and the thrill of the challenge. Harry and Ronald Barber, Amil's nephews, were young, eager, and ready to prove themselves. They had grown up hearing stories about their uncle's exploits, tales of vaults cracked open, of wealth taken from the hands of those who had too much. To them, Amil was a legend, and they wanted to be a part of that legend. Harry was the tech-savvy one, the one who could bypass security systems and navigate through complex wiring with ease. Ronald, on the other hand, was the strategist, his mind sharp, his instincts keen. They were a perfect pair, each one pushing the other, each one determined not to let their uncle down. For Harry and Ronald, the heist was more than just a job. It was a rite of passage, a chance to step into the shoes of the man they had always admired. Charles Mulligan was Amil's brother-in-law, a man who had spent years on the fringes of the law, never quite crossing the line but never quite staying on the right side of it either. Mulligan was the skeptic of the group, the one who questioned everything, who always had a backup plan in case things went wrong. He wasn't as close to Amil as James or the nephews, but he respected Amil's intellect. Mulligan's role was crucial. He was the logistics man, the one who ensured that they had everything they needed. He was the one who rented the townhouse, who made sure that their base of operations was stocked, secure, and inconspicuous. He handled the details that others might overlook, the little things that could make or break a heist. For Mulligan, this was a chance to finally be part of something big, something that could set him up for life. Phil Christopher was the outsider, the man brought in for his specific set of skills. He was an explosives expert, someone who could handle dynamite with a precision that was almost surgical. Phil had spent years perfecting his craft, working on jobs that required not just brute force but a delicate touch. He knew how to blast through concrete without causing a collapse, how to make an entrance without triggering alarms. Phil wasn't a part of the Dinsio family, but he understood the stakes. He knew the risks, and he thrived on them. For Phil, the heist was a chance to showcase his talent, to prove that he was the best at what he did. He was a professional, and he approached the job with the kind of cold, calculated detachment that made him invaluable to Amil's plan. Charles Bruckle was the locksmith, the man who could turn the most complex locks into open doors. He had spent his life mastering the art of lockpicking, and there was no vault door, no combination lock that he couldn't crack. Bruckle was the quiet one of the group, a man who spoke little but whose hands worked magic. He was meticulous, patient, and above all confident in his abilities. For Bruckle, this was the ultimate challenge. A vault that was supposed to be impenetrable, a lock that was supposed to be unbreakable. It was the kind of challenge that he lived for, and he wasn't about to let it pass him by. He worked alongside Phil, his delicate touch complementing the explosive force that Phil brought to the team. Together, they were unstoppable. The plan began not with blueprints or tools, but with a conversation, a meeting between Amil and James in a small diner back in Ohio. It was there that Amil first spoke of the United California Bank, of the rumors about Nixon's slush fund, of the millions that lay waiting to be taken. James listened, his eyes widening as Amil laid it all out. It was bold, audacious, and incredibly risky. But it was also brilliant. James was in. From there, the crew began to form. Amil reached out to Harry and Ronald, knowing that his nephews would jump at the chance to be part of something so monumental. Mulligan, Phil, and Braukel were brought in for their specific skills, each one adding a crucial piece to the puzzle. They met in secret, their conversations hushed, their meetings always in different locations to avoid suspicion. Amil spoke with conviction, his words painting a picture of success, of wealth beyond their wildest dreams. He laid out the plan step by step, each detail meticulously thought out. They would rent a townhouse near the bank, use it as their base of operations. They would gather their tools, practice their entry, and when the time was right, they would strike. The night before, the heist was one of tension and anticipation. The crew gathered in the townhouse, the air thick with the weight of what they were about to do. They went over the plan one last time, each man knowing his role, each one understanding that there was no room for error. They checked their equipment, their tools, the dynamite that Phil had prepared with such precision. Amil looked at each of them, his eyes locking with theirs. He spoke of the stakes, of the risks, but also of the reward. He reminded them why they were there, not just for the money, but for the challenge, for the chance to prove that they could do what no one else could. They were ready. As the hours ticked by, the tension only grew. The crew knew that there was no turning back. They were in this together, a brotherhood bound not by blood but by ambition. Each man had his doubts, his fears, but they pushed them aside. They trusted Amil, trusted each other, and that trust was what held them together. The heist was more than just a crime, it was a test of their loyalty, their skills, their ability to work as one. They knew that if they succeeded, they would go down in history, and if they failed, they would lose everything. As we end this part of the story, we leave you with the image of 6 men gathered in a small townhouse, their eyes filled with determination, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They were on the brink of something extraordinary. Either they would succeed and walk away with millions, or they would fail and face the full force of the law. The night of the heist was upon them, and there was no turning back. They had planned, conspired, and prepared for this moment, and now all that was left was to act. But would their plan go off without a hitch, or would the cracks begin to show? If you missed where we talked about the heist, please go back and enjoy the tale of the night that defined them, the night that made them legends. The heist had happened, and nothing would ever be the same again. No matter how meticulous the planning, no matter how carefully orchestrated the heist, there's always something that gets overlooked, always a thread that, when pulled, unravels the entire plan. For Amil Dinsio and his crew, that thread was a series of tiny mistakes, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, but together enough to lead authorities straight to their door. The crew had done everything they could to cover their tracks after the heist. They cleaned the townhouse, wiping down surfaces, vacuuming the floors, removing any trace that they had been there. They knew the risks. They knew that even the smallest piece of evidence could be their downfall. But even the most experienced criminals can make mistakes, and for Amil's crew, those mistakes would prove costly. It was a generous tip to a taxi driver that first raised suspicions. The crew had hired the taxi to take them to and from the townhouse, and in their excitement after the heist, they had given the driver far more than the standard fare. The driver, intrigued by the unusually large tip and the strange behavior of his passengers, mentioned the incident to the authorities, sparking their curiosity. It was a small detail, but it was enough to catch the attention of investigators. Then there was the dishwasher, the one thing they hadn't thought to empty. Amid the frenzy of cleaning and wiping down surfaces, the crew had overlooked the dishes they'd used during their stay. Fingerprints left on a dinner plate in the dishwasher would become the smoking gun, providing investigators with a direct link to the men who had pulled off one of the largest bank heists in U.S. history. The investigation quickly gained momentum. The FBI, working alongside local law enforcement, began piecing together the puzzle. The taxi driver's tip led them to the townhouse, and the fingerprints found on the dinner plate provided them with a crucial lead. From there, the pieces began to fall into place. The FBI had dealt with heists before, but this one was different. The scale of the burglary, the precision with which it had been executed, and the sheer audacity of the plan all pointed to a team of professionals. The agents knew they were dealing with experienced criminals, men who knew how to cover their tracks, how to operate under the radar. But they also knew that no one was perfect, and that even the most careful criminals made mistakes. They began to dig deeper, tracing the movements of the crew, looking for any connection that could lead them to the mastermind. They interviewed neighbors, combed through rental records, and followed every lead, no matter how small. Slowly, but surely, they began to build a case that would ultimately lead them to Amil Dinsio and his crew. For Amil Dinsio, the days following the heist were a mix of exhilaration and unease. The heist had been a success. They had made off with millions, and they had done it without a hitch. But there was a nagging feeling that Amil couldn't shake, a sense that something had been overlooked, that they hadn't covered their tracks as well as they thought. Amil was a seasoned professional. He had pulled off heists before, and he knew the importance of being cautious in the days and weeks following a job. He kept a low profile, avoiding contact with the other members of the crew, avoiding anything that might draw attention to himself. But despite his best efforts, he couldn't escape the feeling that the authorities were closing in. It started with a phone call, one of the crew members calling to tell him that the FBI had been asking questions, that they had visited the townhouse, that they were looking for fingerprints. Amil's heart sank. He knew what that meant. He knew that once the FBI had a lead, they wouldn't stop until they had him in handcuffs. The anxiety began to build. Amil knew he had to stay calm, that he had to think clearly, but it wasn't easy. The pressure was immense. The knowledge that at any moment, there could be a knock on his door, that at any moment everything could come crashing down. He tried to go about his daily life, tried to act as though nothing was wrong, but the weight of what they had done was always there, pressing down on him. The FBI's investigation eventually led them to Amil's doorstep. They had the evidence they needed, the fingerprints, the witness statements, the connections that linked him to the heist. They knew who they were dealing with, and they knew that Amil was not the type to go down without a fight. The arrest was swift and decisive. The FBI surrounded Amil's home, their presence a stark reminder that no matter how careful he had been, no matter how meticulously he had planned, there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Amil was taken into custody, his hands cuffed behind his back, his head held high. He knew it was over, but he wasn't about to show fear. He had lived his life on his own terms, and he would face the consequences the same way. As he was led away, Amil couldn't help but think of the crew, the men who had stood by his side, who had trusted him, who had believed in the plan. He wondered where they were, if they had been caught, if they were facing the same fate. He wondered if it had all been worth it, the risk, the danger, the uncertainty. He had wanted to pull off the ultimate heist, to make history, and in a way, he had succeeded. But at what cost? Then there was the dishwasher, the one thing they hadn't thought to empty. Amid the frenzy of cleaning and wiping down surfaces, the crew had overlooked the dishes they'd used during their stay. Fingerprints left on a dinner plate in the dishwasher would become the smoking gun, providing investigators with a direct link to the men who had pulled off one of the largest bank heists in U.S. history. The investigation quickly gained momentum. The FBI, working alongside local law enforcement, began piecing together the puzzle. The taxi driver's tip led them to the townhouse, and the fingerprints found on the dinner plate provided them with a crucial lead. From there, the pieces began to fall into place. The FBI had dealt with heists before, but this one was different. The scale of the burglary, the precision with which it had been executed, and the sheer audacity of the plan all pointed to a team of professionals. The agents knew they were dealing with experienced criminals, men who knew how to cover their tracks, how to operate under the radar. But they also knew that no one was perfect, and that even the most careful criminals made mistakes. They began to dig deeper, tracing the movements of the crew, looking for any connection that could lead them to the mastermind. They interviewed neighbors, combed through rental records, and followed every lead, no matter how small. Slowly, but surely, they began to build a case that would ultimately lead them to Amil Dinsio and his crew. For Amil Dinsio, the days following the heist were a mix of exhilaration and unease. The heist had been a success. They had made off with millions, and they had done it without a hitch. But there was a nagging feeling that Amil couldn't shake, a sense that something had been overlooked, that they hadn't covered their tracks as well as they thought. Amil was a seasoned professional. He had pulled off heists before, and he knew the importance of being cautious in the days and weeks following a job. He kept a low profile, avoiding contact with the other members of the crew, avoiding anything that might draw attention to himself. But despite his best efforts, he couldn't escape the feeling that the authorities were closing in. It started with a phone call, one of the crew members calling to tell him that the FBI had been asking questions, that they had visited the townhouse, that they were looking for fingerprints. Amil's heart sank. He knew what that meant. He knew that once the FBI had a lead, they wouldn't stop until they had him in handcuffs. The anxiety began to build. Amil knew he had to stay calm, that he had to think clearly, but it wasn't easy. The pressure was immense. The knowledge that at any moment, there could be a knock on his door, that at any moment everything could come crashing down. He tried to go about his daily life, tried to act as though nothing was wrong, but the weight of what they had done was always there, pressing down on him. The FBI's investigation eventually led them to Amil's doorstep. They had the evidence they needed, the fingerprints, the witness statements, the connections that linked him to the heist. They knew who they were dealing with, and they knew that Amil was not the type to go down without a fight. The arrest was swift and decisive. The FBI surrounded Amil's home, their presence a stark reminder that no matter how careful he had been, no matter how meticulously he had planned, there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Amil was taken into custody, his hands cuffed behind his back, his head held high. He knew it was over, but he wasn't about to show fear. He had lived his life on his own terms, and he would face the consequences the same way. As he was led away, Amil couldn't help but think of the crew, the men who had stood by his side, who had trusted him, who had believed in the plan. He wondered where they were, if they had been caught, if they were facing the same fate. He wondered if it had all been worth it, the risk, the danger, the uncertainty. He had wanted to pull off the ultimate heist, to make history, and in a way, he had succeeded. But at what cost? As the sentences were read, there was a palpable tension in the courtroom. For Amil and his crew, this was the end of the line, a line they had crossed willingly, knowing full well the risks, but perhaps never truly believing that they would be caught. They had planned for everything except for this, the cold, harsh reality of a courtroom, the weight of the law bearing down on them. Amil listened to his sentence without flinching. There was no outburst, no protest, just a stoic acceptance of what was to come. He had lived his life by his own rules, and now he would pay the price for it. He turned to look at his family one last time before being led away. A small nod, a silent promise that he would endure whatever came next. Prison was a stark contrast to the life Amil had known. Gone were the days of meticulous planning, of the thrill of the heist, of the adrenaline rush that came with every successful burglary. Now, his days were filled with monotony, waking up at the same time every day, the clanging of metal doors, the watchful eyes of guards, the limited interactions with the outside world. Amil was not just any prisoner. He was a notorious figure, the man behind the United California Bank Heist, and that reputation followed him behind bars. Some inmates admired him, fascinated by the audacity of what he had pulled off, while others resented him, seeing him as just another criminal who had tried and failed. Amil kept mostly to himself, spending his time reflecting on what had happened, on the choices he had made, on the life he had lived. He thought often of his crew, James, Harry, Ronald, Charles Mulligan, Phil Christopher, and Charles Brukel. He wondered how they were holding up, if they regretted what they had done, if they would do it all over again given the chance. He thought of his family, of the people he had let down, of the life he had wanted to provide for them. It was a heavy burden to bear, and there were days when the weight of it all seemed too much to handle. The United California Bank Heist left a lasting impact, not just on those who were involved, but on the entire banking industry. The sheer scale of the heist, the audacity of blasting through a bank's roof with dynamite, the precision with which the crew had executed the plan, it all highlighted the vulnerabilities in the banking system, vulnerabilities that could no longer be ignored. In response to the heist, banks across the country began to reevaluate their security protocols. Vaults were reinforced, alarm systems were upgraded, and security measures became more stringent. The heist had shown that even the most secure institutions were not infallible, that even the most trusted systems could be breached. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that no matter how secure something seemed, there was always someone out there looking for a way in. For law enforcement, the heist was a lesson in the importance of attention to detail. It was the small things, the fingerprints on a dinner plate, the generous tip to a taxi driver, that had ultimately led to the crew's downfall. It was a reminder that even the most careful criminals could make mistakes, and that it was the job of investigators to find those mistakes, to follow every lead no matter how insignificant it seemed. The audacity and scale of the United California Bank Heist captured the imagination of the public. It was a story that had everything: mystery, danger, a rumored connection to the president, and a crew of seasoned criminals who had taken on the challenge of a lifetime. It was a story that people couldn't get enough of, and it quickly became a cultural phenomenon. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, and the story of Amil Dinsio and his crew became a part of American folklore. It was the kind of story that people told their friends, the kind of story that made people wonder what they would have done in the same situation. It was a story of ambition, of risk, of the fine line between success and failure. For Amil, the knowledge that his story had become a part of history was a small consolation. He had wanted to make a name for himself, and in that sense he had succeeded. But it was not the kind of legacy he had hoped for. He had wanted to be remembered as a man who had beaten the odds, who had pulled off the ultimate heist. Instead, he was remembered as a cautionary tale, a reminder that crime, no matter how well planned, always comes with a price. One of the most intriguing aspects of the United California Bank Heist was the fate of the stolen wealth. While some of the cash and valuables were eventually recovered, a significant portion remains missing to this day. The question of what happened to the money, where it went, and who might still have it has only added to the mystique of the heist. There are countless theories. Some believe that the money was hidden away, waiting for the day when Amil or one of his crew could retrieve it. Others think that it was quickly laundered and spent, dispersed among a network of criminals who helped facilitate the heist. The truth remains elusive, and it is this unanswered question that has kept the story alive for so many years. It is a mystery that continues to captivate those who hear it, a reminder that even when the criminals are caught, the story is never truly over. As Amil Dinsio sat in his cell, he had plenty of time to reflect on the choices he had made. He had always been driven by the desire for more money, more excitement, more recognition. He had wanted to prove himself, to show that he could pull off the impossible. And in a way, he had. He had planned and executed one of the most audacious heists in American history. But in the end, it had cost him everything: his freedom, his family, his future. For the younger generation of criminals, Amil's story was both an inspiration and a warning. It was proof that with the right skills, the right planning, and the right team, anything was possible. But it was also a stark reminder of the price of ambition, of the consequences that came with crossing the line. Amil had lived by his own rules, but in the end, he had been brought down by the very system he had sought to defy. The United California Bank Heist was more than just a crime. It was a statement. It was a challenge to authority, a defiance of the status quo, a declaration that no vault was impenetrable, that no system was foolproof. It was a story of ambition, of risk, of the pursuit of a dream that ultimately led to downfall. As we close the final chapter of this story, we are left with the image of Amil Dinsio, a man who dared to dream big, who dared to defy the odds, but who ultimately paid the price for his ambition. His story is a reminder that in the world of crime, there are no guarantees, no promises of success. There is only the thrill of the chase, the risk of getting caught, and the knowledge that in the end the house always wins. The United California Bank Heist will forever be remembered as one of the most daring and audacious crimes in American history. A story of ambition, of risk, of the fine line between success and failure. And while Amil Dinsio and his crew may have been caught, their story lives on, a testament to the power of ambition and the price that comes with chasing a dream.